The rain fell like bullets on the Seoul streets, each drop a percussion against Kira Williams' bruised skin as she ran through the maze of neon-lit alleys. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the metallic taste of fear coating her tongue while her bare feet slapped against wet pavement. Behind her, the echo of heavy footsteps and shouting voices grew closer, Marcus's rage carrying through the night like a hunting call. She clutched the fragments of her shattered phone, the screen dark and useless, her lifeline to the world severed as cleanly as everything else Marcus had destroyed. The purple bruise around her left eye throbbed with each heartbeat, a reminder of his latest lesson about what happened when she tried to leave. But this time she had finally run. This time she wouldn't go back. I wonder where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever felt that desperate need to find safety in an unfamiliar place. The feeling of being completely alone in a world that suddenly seems full of predators. Comment below and let me know what part of the world you're experiencing this story from. The narrow alley opened onto a broader street lined with elegant storefronts and restaurants, their warm golden light spilling onto the rain-soaked sidewalks like promises of sanctuary. Kira's eyes swept frantically across the options, seeking somewhere, anywhere, that might offer refuge from the storm behind her. Her gaze landed on a sophisticated Korean restaurant, its name written in both Korean characters and English, Moonlight Garden. Through the large windows, she could see the soft glow of pendant lights illuminating diners at pristine tables. The scene peaceful and civilized and everything her life had not been for months. Without hesitation, she pushed through the heavy glass door, the sudden warmth and quiet hitting her like a physical embrace. The hostess, a young Korean woman in an elegant black dress, looked up with professional courtesy that quickly shifted to concern as she took in Kira's appearance. Soaked clothes clung to her shivering frame, her hair plastered to her skull, and the bruise on her face told its own story. "May I help you?" the hostess asked gently, her accent soft and musical. Kira's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Please, I just need somewhere to sit for a moment. I can pay." The lie fell easily from her lips. She had $17 in her pocket and no credit cards Marcus hadn't already maxed out. But desperation made liars of honest people. The hostess studied her face for a long moment, something shifting in her expression that looked almost like recognition of a shared experience. "Of course," she said finally. "Right this way." As they moved deeper into the restaurant, Kira became aware of eyes following her progress. Not the curious stares she might have expected in a high-end establishment, but something more assessing, more calculating. The diners here carried themselves with a particular quality she couldn't quite name, a controlled stillness that spoke of people who were accustomed to watching and being watched. At the far end of the dining room, partially concealed behind a decorative screen, sat a man who commanded attention without seeming to try. Jin-Woo Park observed the wet, desperate woman being led to a corner table with the same analytical focus he brought to everything that entered his domain. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, every line of it speaking to expense and power, while his stillness held the quality of a predator conserving energy. She was beautiful beneath the fear and bruising, that much was obvious. But it was not her beauty that caught his attention. It was the way she held herself despite everything, the straight line of her spine even as she shook with cold and terror. She was running from something, someone, and whatever it was had put that particular haunted look in her eyes that he recognized from his own mirror in younger days. Jinwoo's lieutenant, Minjun, leaned closer to murmur in Korean. "Should we be concerned about her presence here?" "Not yet," Jinwoo replied in the same language, never taking his eyes off the woman as she accepted a cup of tea from their hostess. "But watch the doors." Kira wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic cup, feeling sensation slowly return to her frozen fingers. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the soft clink of silverware against china, a world away from the chaos she had escaped. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to breathe, to think, to plan what came next. The planning lasted exactly 7 minutes. The front door exploded inward with enough force to rattle the windows, and Marcus strode in like a storm system given human form. His massive frame filled the entrance, water dripping from his jacket, while his wild eyes swept the dining room with predatory intensity. Two of his friends flanked him, both looking like the kind of men who solve problems with their fists first and questions second. "Where is she?" Marcus shouted, his voice cutting through the restaurant's refined atmosphere like a chainsaw. "I know she's in here. Kira, get out here right now." Every conversation stopped. Every fork paused halfway to waiting mouths. But instead of the panic Kira expected, she saw something else entirely in the faces around her. Annoyance, cold assessment, and from the man in the expensive suit behind the decorative screen, something that looked very much like controlled anger. Jinwoo rose from his table with the fluid grace of a dancer, or perhaps a fighter. His movement was economical, purposeful, and it drew every eye in the room. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the space without any need for shouting. "You are disturbing my guests," he said in accented but precise English. "I suggest you leave." Marcus turned toward the voice, his lips curling into a sneer when he saw the slight Korean man in the business suit. "And I suggest you mind your own business, pretty boy. I'm looking for my woman, and I'm not leaving without her." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jinwoo's expression never changed, but something shifted in his posture, something that made Kira's breath catch in her throat. Around the dining room, she noticed other patrons adjusting their positions slightly, hands moving closer to jackets, bodies angling toward exits. This was not a normal restaurant, and these were not normal diners. "Your woman?" Jinwoo repeated, the words carrying a weight that made Marcus's friends shift nervously behind him. Interesting phrase. "I was not aware that people could be owned." He began walking forward, and Kira found herself holding her breath. There was something hypnotic about his movement, predatory and controlled. Each step he took seemed to expand the space he commanded, until the entire restaurant felt like an extension of his presence. Marcus puffed up his chest, trying to intimidate through sheer size. "Look, I don't know what kind of fancy place this is, but that woman is coming with me whether you like it or not." Jinwoo stopped just out of arm's reach, close enough that Marcus had to look down to meet his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was soft, conversational, and absolutely terrifying. "I think you misunderstand your situation," he said. "This is my establishment. These are my guests. That woman has sought sanctuary here, which makes her my responsibility. You have 30 seconds to leave before I decide you are a threat that needs to be permanently removed." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Marcus looked around the room, perhaps finally noticing the quality of attention he was receiving. The way conversations had stopped entirely and every face had turned toward their confrontation. Whatever he saw there made him take a step backward. "This isn't over," he snarled, but the fight had gone out of him. "You can't protect her forever." Jinwoo's smile was sharp as a blade. "Try me." Marcus hesitated for another moment, then turned and stalked out, his friends hurrying to follow. The door closed behind them with a soft chime, and gradually, conversation resumed throughout the restaurant as if nothing had happened. Jinwoo walked to Kira's table with the same measured pace, stopping beside her chair. She looked up into dark eyes that seemed to see everything, catalog everything, understand everything about her situation with a single glance. "Are you injured?" he asked quietly. Kira shook her head, not trusting her voice. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her shaky and raw. "He will return," Jinwoo continued matter-of-factly. "Men like that do not accept defeat easily. Do you have somewhere safe to go?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications Kira was only beginning to understand. She looked into his face, seeing intelligence and power and something else, something that made her answer honestly despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "No," she whispered. "I have nowhere left to go." Jinwoo nodded once, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Then we will discuss your options. But first you should eat something. You look like you have not had a proper meal in some time." He gestured to the hostess, who approached immediately with the deference of someone accustomed to following orders without question. "Prepare a private dining room," he said in Korean, then switched back to English. "And bring our guest whatever she requires." As the hostess hurried away, Jinwoo studied Kira's face with the same intensity she had noticed when he faced down Marcus. She had the strangest feeling that he was reading her entire history in the bruises and the fear and the way she held her shoulders despite everything. "My name is Jinwoo Park," he said finally, "and you have just entered a world where your problems can be solved. But like everything worthwhile, the solution will require payment." Kira met his gaze, recognizing the moment for what it was. A crossroads. A choice between the known danger behind her and the unknown danger in front of her. But as she looked into Jinwoo's dark eyes, she realized that for the first time in months, she did not feel afraid. "What kind of payment?" she asked. His smile was enigmatic, revealing nothing and everything at once. "We will discuss terms over dinner. But first tell me your name." "Kira Williams," she said, and felt something fundamental shift in the space between them. "Welcome to Moonlight Garden, Miss Williams. I believe this is the beginning of a very interesting arrangement." The private dining room was a study in understated elegance, with dark wood panels and soft lighting that cast everything in warm amber tones. Kira sat across from Jinwoo at a table that probably cost more than she had made in the last 6 months, picking at the Korean dishes that had appeared without her ordering them. Each bite was a revelation of flavors she had never experienced, but her appetite remained buried under layers of anxiety and exhaustion. Jinwoo ate with precise, measured movements, his attention seeming to divide equally between his food and her face. She could feel him cataloging every micro-expression, every gesture, as if she were a puzzle he was methodically solving piece by piece. Minjun entered the room without knocking, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who had earned the right to interrupt his boss. He approached Jinwoo's chair and leaned down to whisper rapidly in Korean, his expression serious. Kira watched Jinwoo's face as he listened, noting the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Interesting," Jinwoo murmured in response, then dismissed his lieutenant with a subtle nod. When they were alone again, he set down his chopsticks and gave Kira his full attention. "It seems your situation is more complicated than it first appeared," he said. "My people have done some research into your Marcus Johnson. He has recently aligned himself with a crew that operates in territory adjacent to mine. They call themselves the Iron Dogs, and they have been testing boundaries for several months now." Kira's stomach dropped. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means that your personal problem has become entangled with my business concerns." Jinwoo replied with the same calm tone he might use to discuss the weather. "Marcus is not simply an abusive ex-boyfriend seeking to reclaim what he sees as his property. He is now a potential weapon aimed at my organization." The words hit her like cold water. She had run to escape one nightmare only to stumble into another, dragging danger behind her like a chain she could not break. "I should leave," she said, starting to rise from her chair. "I won't let my problems become your problems." Jinwoo's voice stopped her without rising in volume. "Sit down, Miss Williams." Something in his tone made her sink back into the chair before her conscious mind could object. He had not raised his voice or moved from his relaxed position, but the command carried absolute authority. "Where exactly do you plan to go?" he asked reasonably. "Marcus knows your friends, your family, your workplace. He has had months to map your entire world, and now he has additional resources to help him track you. You managed to escape once through luck and desperation. That combination will not serve you twice." Kira stared down at her hands, hating the truth in his words. She had burned through her savings running from Marcus the first time, had already imposed on every friend who might help her until their patience and hospitality ran dry. Her family lived 3 states away and had made it clear that her relationship problems were her own to solve. However, Jinwoo continued, his voice taking on a different quality, "Your problem presents me with an opportunity as well as a complication." She looked up sharply, meeting his dark gaze. "What kind of opportunity?" "Marcus and his new associates believe they can use you to pressure me, to demonstrate that my protection has limits. They are wrong, but their attempt will provide me with justification to respond in ways that will settle this territorial dispute permanently. Additionally, my restaurant has been short-staffed for several weeks. You appear intelligent and capable, and you clearly understand the value of hard work. Kira blinked, trying to process what he was suggesting. You want to hire me? I want to offer you employment and protection in exchange for your service and discretion, Jinwoo clarified. You will work in my restaurant, live in the apartment above it, and in return you will be under my protection 24 hours a day. Marcus and his associates will quickly learn that touching what is mine carries consequences they are not prepared to face. The phrase "what is mine" sent an odd shiver down her spine, though she could not determine whether it was fear or something else entirely. And what would this employment entail exactly? Standard restaurant work, initially. Taking orders, serving guests, handling the register. I will evaluate your other skills as time progresses. The apartment upstairs is furnished and secure. My security team monitors the building at all times. Kira studied his face, looking for the trap she was certain must be hidden somewhere in his reasonable words. What do you get out of this arrangement besides a waitress? I get a woman under my protection who Marcus will try to reach, giving me legal justification for whatever response I deem necessary. I get an employee who will be motivated to perform well and maintain discretion about what she observes. And I get the satisfaction of denying my enemies something they believe they are entitled to take. His honesty was somehow more unsettling than a lie would have been. At least with lies, she knew where the danger lay. With Jinwoo, she felt like she was negotiating with a force of nature that happened to speak English. What if I say no? She asked. Then you leave this restaurant tonight and take your chances with whatever resources you have left. Jinwoo replied without hesitation. I will not force you to accept protection you do not want. But I will also not offer it again once you refuse. Kira closed her eyes, weighing her options on a scale that seemed rigged from the start. Stay and become indebted to a man who clearly operated outside the law, or leave and hope Marcus would eventually give up his pursuit. The bruises on her face provided their own commentary on how likely that scenario was. If I agree, what are the terms? What are the boundaries? Jinwoo leaned back in his chair, and she caught a hint of approval in his expression. You will work 6 days a week, Wednesday through Monday, 10-hour shifts. You will live in the apartment rent-free, but you will not bring guests without permission. You will not discuss anything you observe here with anyone outside this organization. You will follow instructions from me or my designated representatives without argument. In return, you will receive competitive wages, complete protection from Marcus and his associates, and a safe place to rebuild your life. And how long does this arrangement last? Until one of us chooses to end it, he said simply, though I would recommend giving it at least 6 months before making any permanent decisions. Men like Marcus rarely maintain focus on a single target that long, especially when that target becomes inconveniently expensive to pursue. Kira found herself nodding before she had consciously made the decision. The alternative was a cold night on the streets and Marcus's eventual success in tracking her down. At least this way she would have time to plan, to save money, to figure out her next move. I accept, she said quietly. Jinwoo smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, the expression seemed entirely genuine. Excellent. Minjun will show you to your apartment and explain the building's security procedures. You start tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock. Wear black pants and a white shirt. We will provide you with an apron and name tag. He rose from the table with fluid grace, then paused. One more thing, Miss Williams. You will find that working for me requires a particular kind of trust. I do not betray those who serve me faithfully, but I also do not tolerate betrayal in return. Do we understand each other? Kira met his gaze and saw something there that was both promise and warning. We understand each other, she replied. The apartment above Moonlight Garden was a revelation. After months of crashing on couches and sleeping in her car, the clean lines and modern furnishings felt like stepping into someone else's life. The space was small but efficiently designed, with a kitchenette, a living area that flowed seamlessly into a bedroom, and a bathroom with the first decent shower she had seen in weeks. Minjun had explained the security system with military precision, showing her the panic button by the bed, the reinforced door locks, and the discreet cameras that monitored the building's entrances. Your safety is our responsibility now, he had said in careful English. But you must also be smart about your choices. The first week passed in a blur of learning names, memorizing the menu, and adapting to the rhythm of an upscale restaurant. Kira discovered that her years of customer service experience translated well, but that Moonlight Garden operated at a level of sophistication she had never encountered. Every detail mattered, from the precise angle of the silverware to the way she addressed the guests who clearly came from a world of money and power. Jinwoo watched her work from his usual table behind the decorative screen, and she found herself increasingly aware of his attention. He never interfered or corrected her directly, but she noticed when her tables received particularly expensive wine without being charged, or when difficult customers became suddenly accommodating after a brief word from Minjun. The other staff treated her with cautious friendliness, clearly aware that she operated under special circumstances but not hostile about it. Yuki, the hostess who had first helped her, became something approaching a friend, offering tips on dealing with demanding guests and explaining the subtle hierarchy that governed the restaurant's operations. It was Yuki who warned her about the phone call on her 5th day. "Your ex-boyfriend has been calling," she said quietly during a lull between lunch and dinner service, "asking questions about you, wanting to know your schedule." Minjun told him you do not work here, but he did not sound convinced. Kira's blood ran cold. How did he even get this number? "The restaurant is listed publicly," Yuki replied with a shrug. "He probably called every Korean restaurant in the city until someone confirmed you had been seen here." That evening, as Kira served her final table of the night, she noticed Jinwoo approaching with his characteristic measured pace. When the last guest had departed and the restaurant had closed, he gestured for her to join him at his private table. "It seems your former boyfriend is more persistent than we initially calculated," he said without preamble. "My security team has observed him conducting surveillance of this building twice in the past 3 days. He appears to be mapping our routines and looking for vulnerabilities." Kira sank into the chair across from him, exhaustion weighing down her shoulders. "I should have known he wouldn't give up this easily. Marcus doesn't like to lose, especially not to someone he thinks he can intimidate." "He cannot intimidate me," Jinwoo said with quiet certainty. "But his persistence does confirm that our arrangement was the correct choice. Without my protection, you would already be back under his control." The thought sent a shudder through her that had nothing to do with the temperature in the restaurant. She had seen what Marcus did to people who defied him, had worn the bruises and covered the marks for months before finally finding the courage to run. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we wait for him to make his move," Jinwoo replied calmly. "And when he does, we will respond in a way that ensures he never troubles you again." There was something in his voice when he said it, something that made her believe absolutely that Jinwoo Park was a man who kept his promises, regardless of what those promises might cost. For the first time since fleeing into the rain a week ago, Kira allowed herself to feel something that might have been hope. Outside, the neon lights of Seoul painted the streets in shifting colors, and somewhere in those streets, Marcus Johnson was planning his next move. But inside Moonlight Garden, surrounded by Jinwoo's controlled power and the quiet efficiency of his people, Kira Williams finally felt like she might have found something worth more than simple survival. She had found a sanctuary guarded by a man who understood that some fights were worth finishing permanently. 3 weeks into her new life, Kira had learned to read the subtle rhythms that governed Moonlight Garden like sheet music. The morning deliveries arrived at precisely 7:30. Jinwoo reviewed the previous night's receipts at 8:15 with his first cup of coffee, and the lunch prep began at 10 with military precision. She had discovered that Jinwoo preferred his coffee black, took his business calls in Korean when they concerned matters she was not meant to understand, and had a habit of adjusting the placement of objects on his desk when he was thinking through complex problems. What she had not expected was how naturally she began to anticipate his needs, or how her presence seemed to settle something restless in his controlled demeanor. When she brought him his afternoon tea without being asked, or reorganized the reservation book in a way that streamlined the evening service, he would look at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as surprised approval. The lunch rush was ending on a Tuesday when Mrs. Chun arrived. Kira knew immediately that something was wrong by the way the woman stormed through the front entrance, her expensive handbag clutched like a weapon and her voice carrying the particular pitch of someone accustomed to getting her way through volume alone. She was demanding to speak to the manager about last night's private party, insisting that the service had been substandard and the bill inflated. Yuki tried to handle the situation with diplomatic skill, but Mrs. Chun was clearly working herself toward the kind of scene that could damage the restaurant's reputation with its other guests. Several nearby tables had begun to stare, their conversations trailing off as they focused on the escalating confrontation. Kira approached with the same calm confidence she had learned from watching Jinwoo handle difficult situations. "Mrs. Chun," she said pleasantly, "I remember you from last evening. I served your table personally. Perhaps we could sit down and discuss your concerns over tea?" The woman whirled toward her, eyes blazing with the kind of anger that sought targets rather than solutions. "I do not want tea," she snapped. "I want to speak to someone with actual authority, not some waitress who probably cannot even count the zeros on my bill correctly." The racial undertone in the comment hung in the air like smoke, and Kira felt her own temper flare in response. But she had learned long ago that losing control in customer service situations only made everything worse, and she was determined not to give Jinwoo any reason to regret his protection. "I understand you are frustrated," Kira replied evenly. "Let me review your bill and see what we can do to address your concerns." She moved toward the hostess station to retrieve the receipt, but Mrs. Chin followed, her voice growing louder with each word. "This is exactly what I am talking about," she declared to the dining room at large. "This establishment claims to be high-end, but they staff it with people who have no business working in a place like this." Kira's hands stilled on the reservation book, something cold and familiar settling in her stomach. She had heard variations of these words before, had learned to recognize the particular way some people wielded their assumptions like weapons. But before she could formulate a response, a presence appeared beside her that changed the entire temperature of the room. Jinwoo moved with his characteristic silent grace, but there was something different in his bearing, something that made every conversation in the restaurant stop mid-sentence. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made Mrs. Chun take an involuntary step backward. "Mrs. Chun," he said with perfect politeness, "I understand there is some concern about your experience last evening." The woman straightened, clearly recognizing him as someone with actual power. "Yes," she began, her tone immediately shifting to something more calculated. "The service was completely inadequate, and frankly, I think this young woman is not suited to work in an establishment of this caliber." Jinwoo's gaze moved to Kira's face, and she saw something flicker in his dark eyes that might have been anger, though his expression remained perfectly controlled. "Miss Williams," he said formally, "please prepare a private table for Mrs. Chun and myself. We will resolve this matter immediately." As Kira moved to comply, she heard Jinwoo continue in the same deceptively mild tone. "Mrs. Chun, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. Miss Williams is not merely an employee here. She is under my personal protection, which means that any disrespect shown to her is disrespect shown to me directly." The implied threat in those words was subtle but unmistakable, and Mrs. Chen's face went pale as she began to understand the magnitude of her miscalculation. 20 minutes later, she left the restaurant with profuse apologies and a comped meal, her earlier arrogance replaced by the kind of nervous politeness that came from recognizing a predator in expensive clothing. When the door closed behind her, Kira found herself alone in the dining room with Jinwoo, the other staff having tactfully disappeared to handle closing duties. She expected him to return to his usual table, to dismiss the incident as a minor business matter handled efficiently. Instead, he approached her with something that looked almost like concern. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. She had handled much worse than Mrs. Chun during her years in customer service, had developed thick skin out of necessity. But there was something in Jinwoo's voice, something that suggested her well-being mattered to him beyond her utility as an employee. "I am fine," she said automatically, then found herself adding, "Thank you for intervening. You did not have to do that." Jinwoo studied her face with the same intensity she had noticed that first night, as if he were reading truths she had not spoken aloud. People like Mrs. Chun believe that money gives them the right to treat others as inferior, he said. They are wrong. And when they are wrong in my establishment, about someone under my protection, I correct their misunderstanding. There was something in the way he said it, something that made Kira understand that his protection was not just practical but personal. She felt an odd warmth in her chest, a sensation she had almost forgotten after months of feeling constantly under threat. Without a word, Jinwoo disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a cup of tea prepared exactly the way she liked it. The gesture was small, almost insignificant, but it carried a weight that made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. When had anyone last paid attention to such details about her preferences? When had anyone last offered comfort without expecting something in return? Drink, he said simply, setting the cup on the table beside her. You have had enough stress for one afternoon. As she wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, Kira found herself studying Jinwoo's profile as he stood beside her. There was something almost protective in his posture, something that reminded her of the way he had positioned himself between her and Marcus that first night. But now she was beginning to understand that his protectiveness was not just territorial instinct but something more personal, more deliberate. "Can I ask you something?" she said impulsively. He turned his full attention to her, and she felt the familiar flutter of awareness that came from being the sole focus of such intense concentration. "What do you want to know? Why did you really offer me this job?" The real reason, not the business justification. Jinwoo was quiet for a long moment, his dark gaze never leaving her face. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of honesty that seemed to surprise them both. "Because when you walked into my restaurant, you reminded me of someone I used to be," he said quietly. "Someone who understood what it meant to run from something that would not let you go. And because when I looked at you, I saw strength that had been battered but not broken. That kind of strength is rare, Miss Williams. It deserves protection." The words settled between them like a confession, and Kira felt something shift in her chest, something that had been locked away for months beginning to unthaw. She had spent so long being told she was weak, that she brought her problems on herself, that she deserved whatever treatment she received. To hear someone like Jinwoo speak of her strength felt like being given permission to remember who she had been before Marcus had tried to strip that identity away. "What about you?" she asked softly. "What are you running from?" Jinwoo's smile was sharp and brief, more acknowledgement than humor. "I am not running," he replied. "I am standing exactly where I need to be, doing exactly what needs to be done. But the cost of that position is higher than most people understand." Before Kira could ask him to elaborate, the moment was interrupted by Minjun's quiet arrival. He approached Jinwoo and spoke rapidly in Korean, his expression serious. As Kira watched, Jinwoo's face hardened into the mask of controlled authority she had learned to recognize as his business expression. "What is it?" she asked, though she was not certain she wanted to know the answer. Jinwoo's gaze moved back to her face, and she saw something there that might have been regret. "Marcus left a message for you," he said quietly. "Minjun found it attached to your car this morning." The warmth from the tea seemed to drain from her body all at once. "What kind of message?" Jinwoo gestured to Minjun, who produced a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. Jinwoo read it silently, his jaw tightening with each line, before passing it to her with obvious reluctance. The message was written in Marcus's familiar scrawl, the same handwriting that had once left her love notes and birthday cards. Now it carried a different kind of intimacy, the intimacy of a predator who knew his prey's weaknesses. "You can hide behind your Korean boyfriend all you want, but you and I both know you belong to me. He cannot watch you every second of every day. And when he slips up, when you are alone for just one moment, I will be there. You cannot run forever, Kira. Come home before I have to drag you back." Kira's hands trembled as she set the note down on the table, the familiar cocktail of fear and rage rising in her throat. Marcus had always been skilled at finding exactly the words that would burrow under her skin, that would make her doubt her own strength and decisions. Jinwoo reached across the space between them and covered her shaking hands with his own. His touch was warm and steady, anchoring her to the present moment and the safety of Moonlight Garden. When she looked up into his face, She saw something there that made her breath catch. Not pity or obligation, but genuine anger on her behalf. "He is wrong," Jinwoo said with quiet certainty. "You do not belong to him. You do not belong to anyone but yourself. And he will learn that there are consequences for threatening what is under my protection." The phrase "what is under my protection" should have felt possessive, controlling. Instead, it felt like the first promise anyone had made to her in months that she actually believed. As she sat there with Jinwoo's hands covering hers and his dark eyes holding her gaze, Kira realized that somewhere between serving his tea and learning his habits, she had begun to trust him in ways that had nothing to do with their business arrangement. Outside, Seoul moved through its evening rhythms, neon signs flickering to life and traffic flowing through the arteries of the city. But inside Moonlight Garden, in the circle of Jinwoo's protection and the warmth of his unexpected tenderness, Kira Williams discovered that safety could feel like something worth fighting to keep. The crisis arrived on a Thursday morning with the kind of quiet efficiency that characterized all of Jinwoo's business dealings. Kira was reviewing the evening's reservations when she noticed the subtle shift in the restaurant's atmosphere. The way conversations became more urgent and staff members moved with heightened purpose. Minjun appeared at Jinwoo's table more frequently than usual, their Korean exchanges rapid and clipped. It was not until she overheard a heated phone conversation that she began to understand the magnitude of what was unfolding. Jinwoo spoke in English when he wanted her to understand, Korean when he did not, but anger transcended language barriers. Even without knowing the specific words, she could hear the controlled fury in his voice, the careful modulation that came from a man accustomed to wielding power through precision rather than volume. When he finally ended the call, Jinwoo sat in perfect stillness for nearly a minute, his hands folded on the table and his gaze fixed on some middle distance that existed beyond the restaurant's walls. Kira found herself moving toward his table without conscious decision, drawn by an instinct she could not name. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked quietly. Jinwoo's gaze snapped to her face, and she saw something there she had never witnessed before. Not vulnerability exactly, but a kind of weariness that spoke to the weight he carried every day. For a moment, his carefully controlled mask slipped, and she glimpsed the man beneath the authority. "Our primary seafood supplier has terminated our contract," he said finally. "Apparently, they have received a more attractive offer from a competitor, along with some encouragement to sever their relationship with us." The words were neutral, but Kira could hear the implications beneath them. Someone was applying pressure to Jinwoo's business associates, trying to isolate him economically before moving to more direct confrontation. She had learned enough about his world to understand that such tactics were often preludes to violence. Without thinking, she pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts. "What kind of seafood do you need?" she asked. Jinwoo watched her with curiosity rather than dismissal. "High-quality fish and shellfish, sufficient to supply a restaurant of this caliber. But Miss Williams, finding suppliers who meet our standards is not simply a matter of making phone calls." Kira was already dialing, her mind racing through possibilities. "My cousin Jerome works for a fishing company that supplies restaurants all over the East Coast," she said. "They specialize in premium seafood, and they are not afraid of difficult customers or complicated delivery requirements." The conversation that followed was conducted in the rapid-fire slang of family relationships and shared history, Kira switching between professional courtesy and the easy intimacy of blood connections. She explained the situation without revealing too many details, emphasized the urgency without sounding desperate, and negotiated terms with the kind of natural skill that came from years of managing difficult situations. When she hung up 20 minutes later, she had secured a temporary supplier willing to deliver that afternoon, along with the promise of a long-term contract if the quality met expectations. Jinwoo had listened to the entire conversation with growing interest, his expression shifting from skepticism to something approaching amazement. "They will be here at 3 o'clock, she reported. "Jerome says they can match your previous supplier's quality at a lower price, and they are not easily intimidated by competitors or pressure tactics. Apparently, they have dealt with worse than territorial disputes between restaurant suppliers." Jinwoo stared at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of genuine admiration. How did you know that your cousin's company would be suitable for our needs? Kira felt heat rise in her cheeks, suddenly self-conscious about the assumptions she had made. I have been watching how this place operates for a month, she said quietly. I know what kind of standards you maintain, what level of quality you expect. And I know Jerome. He would not risk his reputation by vouching for a supplier that could not deliver what they promised. Something shifted in Jinwoo's expression, a recognition that went deeper than professional appreciation. You have been paying attention, he said softly. I pay attention to things that matter, she replied, then felt her breath catch at the intensity of his gaze. The seafood delivery arrived exactly on schedule, and within an hour, the kitchen staff had pronounced the quality exceptional. Jinwoo negotiated a permanent contract with terms that were significantly more favorable than his previous arrangement, and by evening service, the crisis had been resolved with minimal disruption to the restaurant's operations. But it was not until after closing, when the last guest had departed and the staff had finished their cleanup duties, that Jinwoo approached her with something that looked almost like gratitude mixed with surprise. Walk with me, he said simply. They left Moonlight Garden through a back exit that opened onto a small garden courtyard behind the building, a space Kira had not known existed. String lights created pools of warm illumination among carefully tended plants, and a small fountain provided the gentle sound of moving water. It was unexpectedly peaceful, a hidden sanctuary in the heart of the city. This is beautiful, Kira said, genuinely enchanted by the unexpected oasis. I come here when I need to think, Jinwoo replied. When the weight of responsibility becomes too heavy to carry inside walls that smell of obligation and watchful eyes. He led her to a stone bench beside the fountain, and they sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the scents of jasmine and car exhaust in equal measure. When Jinwoo finally spoke, his voice held a quality she had never heard from him before, something raw and unguarded. Do you know what it means to inherit a life you never chose, he asked. Kira turned to study his profile in the soft light, seeing the tension in his jaw and the way his hands rested too carefully on his knees. I know what it means to have choices taken away from you, she said quietly. Jinwoo nodded slowly, as if her answer had confirmed something he suspected. My father built this organization through intelligence and strategic thinking, but also through violence when violence was necessary. When he died, I was 25 years old with a degree in international business and plans to work in legitimate enterprises. Instead, I inherited an empire that required me to become someone I had never wanted to be. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither of them had expected to cross. Kira found herself leaning slightly closer, drawn by the vulnerability in his voice. But you could have walked away, she said gently. You could have chosen differently. Jinwoo's laugh was brief and bitter. Could I? There were hundreds of people who depended on my father's organization for their livelihoods, their safety, their futures. There were territories to protect, agreements to honor, enemies who would see any sign of weakness as an opportunity to strike. Walking away would have meant abandoning everyone who had served my family faithfully, leaving them vulnerable to predators who understood only force. Kira thought about his words, about the weight of responsibility and the way duty could become its own kind of prison. She had spent so much of her life feeling powerless, controlled by circumstances and other people's choices, that she had never considered how power itself might be another form of captivity. So you chose to protect them instead of protecting yourself, she said. Jinwoo turned to face her fully, and in the soft light, his features seemed younger, more vulnerable than she had ever seen them. I chose to become what they needed me to become, he said quietly. But the cost has been higher than I anticipated. Leadership in this world requires a kind of isolation that most people cannot understand. You cannot show weakness, cannot form attachments that enemies might exploit, cannot trust anyone completely because trust becomes a weapon in the wrong hands. As he spoke, Kira began to understand the true nature of the prison he had built around himself. Not just the practical constraints of his position, but the emotional isolation that came from being responsible for everyone while being truly known by no one. That sounds like a very lonely way to live, she said softly. Jinwoo's gaze moved to her face, and she saw something there that made her pulse quicken. It was, he said simply, until recently. The words carried implications that neither of them was ready to address directly, but the acknowledgement hung in the air between them like a promise. Kira felt her heart rate increase, awareness of their proximity and the intimacy of the moment making her suddenly conscious of every breath, every small movement. Without thinking, she reached out to touch his hand where it rested on the bench between them. The contact was electric, sending warmth up her arm and making him go perfectly still. For a moment, neither of them moved, both seemingly afraid that any motion might break whatever fragile understanding they had stumbled into. It was then that Kira noticed the cut on his palm, a thin line of dried blood across the base of his thumb. Without hesitation, she turned his hand over to examine the injury, her fingers gentle against his skin. "You are hurt," she said, concern overriding her self-consciousness. "It is nothing," Jinwoo replied, but he made no move to pull his hand away from her touch. "A kitchen accident earlier today." Kira stood and disappeared into the restaurant, returning moments later with a first aid kit she had retrieved from behind the bar. She settled back beside him on the bench, closer than before, and began cleaning the cut with careful precision. The intimacy of the task, the way he trusted her to tend to him, felt more significant than any of the conversations they had shared. "You do not have to do this," he said quietly, but his voice lacked any real protest. "I want to," she replied, meeting his gaze as she applied antiseptic to the wound. "You have taken care of me since the night I walked into your restaurant. Let me take care of you for once." As she wrapped a small bandage around his palm, Jinwoo watched her face with an intensity that made her hyper-aware of every small detail. The way her hair fell forward to frame her cheek, the concentration evident in her expression, the gentle competence of her hands as they worked. When she finished and looked up to find him studying her so intently, the air between them seemed to thicken with possibility. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than usual. They were sitting close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could catch the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with something that was purely him. For a moment that stretched like eternity, she thought he might kiss her, thought she might let him, thought she might want him to more than she had wanted anything in months. Instead, he reached up to brush a strand of hair back from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek for just a moment before he pulled back. The gesture was tender enough to make her throat tight with emotion, restrained enough to leave her wanting more. "We should go inside," he said quietly. "It is late, and tomorrow will bring its own complications." But neither of them moved immediately, both reluctant to end the moment that had revealed so much about who they might become to each other. When they finally stood and walked back toward the restaurant, Kira found herself stealing glances at Jinwoo's profile, trying to memorize the softness she had glimpsed beneath his armor of control. It was not until she was alone in her apartment that she allowed herself to acknowledge what had become impossible to deny. Somewhere between the first cup of tea and the bandage around his palm, between his protection and her growing trust, she had begun to fall in love with Jinwoo Park. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She was falling for a man whose world operated by rules she barely understood, whose enemies would see her feelings as a weapon to be used against them both. But as she replayed the vulnerability in his voice and the tenderness in his touch, Kira found that the risk felt worth taking. Outside her window, the city moved through its nightly rhythms, unaware that in a small apartment above a Korean restaurant, a woman who had forgotten how to trust was learning to love again. The attack came during the dinner rush on a Saturday night when Moonlight Garden was at its most crowded and chaotic. Kira was weaving between tables with practiced efficiency, her arms loaded with dishes for the large party celebrating a business merger in the back corner, when she noticed the man at table 7 watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He was not Korean, which was not unusual among their international clientele, but there was something predatory in his attention that reminded her viscerally of Marcus. When she approached his table to refill his water glass, he smiled with the kind of calculated charm that set every alarm bell in her head ringing. "You are even prettier than he said you were," the man commented casually, as if discussing the weather. Kira's hand stilled on the water pitcher, ice forming in her veins. "I am sorry, I do not understand what you mean," she replied carefully. "Marcus Johnson sends his regards," the man continued in the same conversational tone. "He wanted me to tell you that your little vacation is over. Time to come home." Before Kira could respond, before she could even fully process the magnitude of threat implicit in his words, the man's hand shot out and clamped around her wrist with bruising force. The water pitcher slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the entire restaurant. Every conversation stopped. Every face turned toward the sound. And from his table behind the decorative screen, Jin-woo rose to his feet with the fluid grace of a predator that had just identified prey. "Let go of me," Kira said quietly, but her voice carried clearly in the sudden silence. "I do not think so," the man replied, his grip tightening as he began to stand. "Marcus is waiting outside, and he does not like to be kept waiting." That was when Jin-woo moved, and Kira finally understood what controlled lethality actually looked like. He covered the distance between his table and theirs in seconds, his approach so silent and swift that the man barely had time to register the threat before Jin-woo's hand closed around his throat. "Release her," Jin-woo said in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying than if he had shouted. The man's eyes widened as he struggled against Jin-woo's grip, finally letting go of Kira's wrist to claw uselessly at the fingers cutting off his air supply. Around the restaurant, other diners began to shift nervously, some reaching for phones, others moving toward exits with the instinctive recognition that they were witnessing something far more dangerous than a simple altercation. Jin-woo's gaze never left the man's face as he spoke in rapid Korean to Min-jun, who had appeared beside them with several other members of the security team. The man was lifted from his chair and marched toward the back exit with the kind of efficiency that suggested this was not the first time such a situation had been handled. But as Kira watched the man disappear through the kitchen doors, she realized with growing horror that his capture was only the beginning. Marcus was outside, waiting, and he would not have sent only one man to retrieve her. This was a coordinated attack, and she had been the target all along. Jin-woo must have reached the same conclusion because he turned to her with an expression of controlled urgency that made her stomach drop. "We need to get you to safety," he said quietly. "Now." Before she could respond, the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing the restaurant in an eerie red glow that turned every shadow into a potential threat. Through the front windows, Kira could see dark figures moving in the street outside, more men than Marcus could have recruited on his own. "The rival gang," she whispered, understanding flooding through her with sickening clarity. "They are using Marcus to get to you." Jin-woo's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. "Then they have made a fatal miscalculation," he replied. What followed was unlike anything Kira had ever witnessed outside of action movies. Jin-woo's people moved with military precision, transforming Moonlight Garden from an upscale restaurant into a fortress in a matter of minutes. Guests were evacuated through a hidden exit that led to the building next door. Staff members revealed weapons that had been concealed in places she had never suspected. And Jin-woo himself became something entirely different from the controlled businessman she had come to know. He spoke in rapid Korean to his team, coordinating their response with the calm efficiency of someone who had planned for exactly this scenario. When gunfire erupted from the street outside, he moved Kira behind the reinforced bar with gentle but irresistible force. "Stay here," he commanded, and for the first time since she had known him, his voice carried no room for negotiation. "Do not move until I come back for you." "But I can help," Kira protested, hating the thought of cowering while others fought to protect her. Jin-woo cupped her face in his hands, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "You help by staying alive," he said fiercely. "If something happens to you, if they succeed in taking you from me, nothing else matters. Do you understand?" The raw emotion in his voice, the barely controlled desperation beneath his calm facade, hit her like a physical blow. This was not just about protecting an employee or honoring an agreement. This was personal, intimate, essential in ways that neither of them had been willing to acknowledge until this moment. "Jin-woo," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face in return. He leaned into her touch for just a moment, allowing himself that single instant of vulnerability, before the mask of controlled authority slammed back into place. "I will come back for you," he promised. "No matter what happens out there, I will come back." Then he was gone, moving through the restaurant with lethal purpose while Kira pressed herself against the reinforced wall behind the bar and tried not to think about all the ways this could end badly. The battle that followed was brief and utterly decisive. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, Kira could hear Jinwoo's voice cutting through the noise like a conductor directing a deadly orchestra. There were no unnecessary risks, no dramatic heroics, just the systematic dismantling of a threat by people who understood violence as a tool to be wielded with precision rather than passion. When silence finally fell, it was so complete that Kira could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. She counted seconds that felt like hours until Jinwoo reappeared, moving through the wreckage of his restaurant with blood on his shirt and something fierce and protective blazing in his dark eyes. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, pulling her to her feet and running his hands over her arms and face as if checking for injuries. "I am fine," she managed, though her voice came out shaky and thin. "What about you? Is that your blood?" Jinwoo glanced down at his shirt with the kind of detached interest one might show a stain on the tablecloth. "Not mine," he replied simply. The casual way he said it, the matter-of-fact tone that suggested violence, was simply another business skill he had mastered, should have terrified her. She should have been horrified by the methodical way he had orchestrated the destruction of Marcus and his allies, by the cold efficiency with which he had eliminated threats to his territory and his people. Instead, as she looked at Jinwoo standing in the ruins of his restaurant with protective fury still radiating from every line of his body, Kira felt safer than she had ever felt in her entire life. "You are not afraid," he said, and there was something like wonder in his voice as he studied her face. "Should I be?" she asked. Jinwoo moved closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes and catch the scent of his cologne beneath the metallic smell of violence that clung to his clothes. "Most people would be terrified of what they just witnessed," he said quietly, "of what I am capable of when something I care about is threatened." "But you were not protecting everyone," Kira replied, finally understanding the distinction that mattered. "You were protecting me. There is a difference between violence that threatens and violence that shields. I have lived with both, and I know which one you showed me tonight." Something shifted in Jinwoo's expression, a wall crumbling that she had not even realized was still standing between them. When he reached up to cup her face in his hands, his touch was gentle despite the evidence of recent violence that stained his shirt. "I was terrified," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "When I saw that man touching you, when I realized what they had planned, I felt something I had not experienced since I was a child. Complete, paralyzing fear. Not of dying, but of losing you before I had the chance to tell you what you have come to mean to me." Kira felt tears she had not realized she was crying slide down her cheeks. "What do I mean to you?" she whispered. "You mean everything," Jinwoo replied simply. "You are the first person in 15 years who has seen past what I do to who I am. You are the peace I never thought I would find, the home I never thought I deserved. You are the reason I remember what it feels like to be human instead of just a weapon shaped by necessity." The confession broke something open in Kira's chest, something that had been locked away since the first time Marcus raised his hand to her. She had forgotten what it felt like to be cherished rather than controlled, protected rather than possessed, loved rather than owned. "I love you," she said, the words falling from her lips like a prayer. "I love your strength and your vulnerability. I love the way you make me feel safe without making me feel small. I love that you became dangerous to protect people rather than to hurt them. I love you, Jinwoo Park, and I am tired of being afraid to admit it." Jinwoo's response was to kiss her with a desperation that spoke to months of careful control finally breaking down. When their lips met, it was not gentle or tentative but fierce and claiming, a declaration that all the careful boundaries they had maintained were finally, irrevocably shattered. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jinwoo rested his forehead against hers and spoke words that changed everything between them. "Then stay," he said urgently. "Not because you have nowhere else to go, not because you need my protection, but because you choose to be here. Choose to be with me." Choose to build something together that is stronger than the forces that tried to tear us apart. Kira looked around at the wreckage of Moonlight Garden, at the evidence of violence that had been necessary to secure their future, at Jinwoo's face where love and hope and desperate longing warred for dominance. She thought about the woman who had run through Seoul's rain-soaked streets a month ago, terrified and alone and convinced that safety was something that happened to other people. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true strength was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to choose love despite it. "I choose you," she said simply. "I choose this. I choose us." Jinwoo's smile was radiant, transforming his face from something beautiful, but controlled into something incandescent with joy. Then he kissed her again, softer this time, like a promise being sealed with something more precious than words. Outside, Seoul continued its nightly rhythm, unaware that in the ruins of a Korean restaurant, two people who had learned to survive alone had finally found something worth living for together. 3 days after the attack on Moonlight Garden, Kira stood in the center of what had once been the dining room and marveled at the transformation taking place around her. Jinwoo's people worked with the same methodical efficiency they brought to everything else, rebuilding and improving rather than simply repairing. The new security measures were invisible to casual observation but obvious to anyone who understood what to look for. Marcus Johnson would never threaten anyone again. Neither would the members of the rival gang who had thought they could use him as a weapon against Jinwoo's organization. The threat that had hung over her head for months had been eliminated with the kind of permanent finality that only came from men who understood that some problems required absolute solutions. Jinwoo found her there as the afternoon light slanted through the new windows, watching the progress with the same analytical attention he brought to every aspect of his business. When he approached, she noticed that the tension that had defined his posture for weeks was finally gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like peace. "The contractors estimate another week before we can reopen," he said, settling beside her on the temporary seating that had been brought in for planning meetings. "Are you worried about losing business during the closure?" Kira asked. Jinwoo's smile was soft and genuine, the expression of a man who had discovered that some things mattered more than profit margins. "I am more concerned with ensuring that when we do reopen, it is as a place where the people I care about can feel completely secure." The phrase "people I care about" sent warmth through her chest, though she noticed he had not yet spoken directly about where she fit into the restaurant's future. They had shared kisses and confessions in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, but the practical questions about what came next remained unresolved. As if reading her thoughts, Jinwoo turned to face her fully, his expression growing serious. "We need to discuss your employment arrangement," he said carefully. Kira felt her stomach drop, sudden anxiety flooding through her. Of course, the original reason for her presence here had been neutralized along with Marcus and his allies. Jinwoo no longer needed her for strategic purposes, no longer had business justification for keeping her around. "I understand," she said quietly, trying to keep the disappointment out of her voice. "The threat is gone, so the contract is complete. I can start looking for another position immediately." Jinwoo was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the same intensity she had noticed that first night. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been nervousness, though she had never seen him appear uncertain about anything. "Actually, I was thinking we should dissolve the contract entirely," he said. The words hit her like cold water, even though she had been expecting them. "Right," she managed. "That makes sense." Jinwoo reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document, setting it on the small table between them. "This is the original employment agreement we signed," he said formally. "As of this moment, it is null and void. You are free to leave whenever you choose, with no obligations or restrictions of any kind." Kira stared at the document, understanding flooding through her with sickening clarity. He was giving her a clean exit, a way to walk away from his world without consequences or complications. After everything they had shared, after the confessions and the kisses and the promises, he was still offering her an escape route. The practical part of her mind recognized the kindness in the gesture. Jinwoo was giving her the choice she had never really had before, the opportunity to decide her future from a position of complete freedom rather than desperate necessity. But the emotional part of her heart was breaking, because freedom meant nothing if it came at the cost of losing the man she loved. "I see," she said, proud of how steady her voice remained. "And what happens now?" Jinwoo was watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, as if her answer to his question carried weight beyond the simple logistics of employment termination. "What happens now depends entirely on what you want," he replied. The careful neutrality in his tone told her nothing and everything. He was not going to influence her decision through pressure or persuasion. He was giving her the choice he had promised that first night, the freedom to determine her own path without coercion. "What I want," she repeated slowly, turning the phrase over in her mind like a puzzle she was trying to solve. For the first time in years, what she wanted actually mattered more than what someone else expected from her. Kira stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Seoul street where she had first stumbled into Jinwoo's protection. She thought about the woman who had fled through rain-soaked alleys, terrified and desperate and convinced that safety was something that belonged to other people. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to recognize the difference between control that diminished and protection that empowered. When she turned back to face Jinwoo, she found him watching her with barely concealed hope warring with careful restraint. He wanted her to stay, she realized, not because he needed an employee or a strategic advantage, but because he loved her and could not bear the thought of watching her walk away. "What I want," she said clearly, "is to stay here with you. Not as your employee, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I love you and I want to build a life together. I want to be your partner in everything that matters. I want to help you run this restaurant and support your business and be the person you come home to when the weight of responsibility becomes too heavy to carry alone." Jinwoo's expression transformed, joy and relief flooding his features like sunrise after a long night. But he remained seated, as if afraid that moving too quickly might shatter the moment they had both been hoping for. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "My world is not an easy one. There will always be risks, always be people who see any connection to me as either an opportunity or a liability. Once you choose this path, once you become part of my life officially, there will be no going back to anonymity or safety." Kira returned to her seat beside him, close enough to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes and the careful hope he was trying to keep controlled. "I have lived with danger before," she said gently. "The difference is that this time I am choosing it. I am choosing you. I am choosing us." Jinwoo reached for her hands, his touch warm and certain and everything she had learned to associate with safety. "Then I have something to ask you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He pulled a small velvet box from his other pocket, setting it on the table beside the dissolved employment contract. The symbolism was not lost on her. The end of their business arrangement and the beginning of something infinitely more personal. "Kira Williams," he said formally, "will you marry me? Will you become my wife, my partner, my equal in all things that matter? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that love can be stronger than fear, that protection can coexist with freedom, that two people who learn to survive alone can create something beautiful together?" Kira looked at the ring box, at the dissolved contract, at Jinwoo's face where vulnerability and hope and desperate love were written in equal measure. She thought about fairy tales and happy endings, about the difference between being rescued and being empowered, about what it meant to choose love from a position of strength rather than desperation. "Yes," she said simply, and watched as Jinwoo's careful control finally cracked entirely, joy transforming his face into something incandescent. The ring was perfect, simple and elegant, and exactly what she would have chosen for herself if she had been brave enough to imagine such possibilities. When he slipped it onto her finger, the gesture felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure at the same time. 6 months later, Kira Park stood in the same spot where she had once watched contractors rebuild Moonlight Garden. But now she was overseeing the final preparations for their wedding reception. The restaurant had been transformed into something magical, with white flowers and soft lighting creating an atmosphere of celebration and new beginnings. The ceremony itself had been small and intimate, conducted in the hidden garden behind the building where they had first shared their vulnerabilities. Jinwoo's family had welcomed her with warmth that spoke to their relief at seeing him finally find happiness. while her own family had traveled from across the country to witness her transformation from victim to survivor to beloved wife. Now, as guests began to arrive for the reception, Kira felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond simple happiness. She had not just escaped her past. She had built a future worth celebrating. Moonlight Garden was thriving under their joint management, combining her natural warmth with his strategic brilliance. The legitimate businesses were expanding, while the darker aspects of his organization operated with the kind of moral boundaries that she had helped him establish. Jinwoo appeared beside her as if summoned by her thoughts, looking devastatingly handsome in his formal suit and radiating the kind of contentment she had never imagined possible in a man who carried so much responsibility. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, echoing the question he had posed the night they first kissed. Kira turned in his arms, seeing their future reflected in his dark eyes. "About choosing you? About choosing this life? About becoming the kind of woman who is brave enough to love a dangerous man who turned out to be the safest place I have ever known?" She rose on her toes to kiss him, soft and sweet, and full of promises they would spend a lifetime keeping. "Never," she whispered against his lips. "Not a single one." Through the windows of Moonlight Garden, Seoul pulsed with its eternal rhythm of ambition and dreams, danger and opportunity. But inside the restaurant, surrounded by friends and family and the evidence of everything they had built together, Mr. and Mrs. Park danced to music that spoke of love stories that began in chaos and ended in joy. Kira had learned that sometimes the most unexpected sanctuaries were the ones guarded by men who understood that true strength lay not in the ability to control others, but in the willingness to offer protection without demanding surrender. And Jinwoo had discovered that the greatest victories were not won through strategy or force, but through the simple act of giving someone the freedom to choose love over fear. Together, they had proven that some fairy tales were worth fighting for, and that the best happy endings were the ones you built with your own hands, one choice at a time.